This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Greetings, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Our first question is, why does experiencing higher levels of anxiety worsen my autoimmune symptoms for ulcerative colitis, but taking glucocorticoids, prednisone, relieves them?
Let's expand that question a little bit to, rather than just anxiety, more broadly stress, relationship between stress and autoimmunity. Many moons ago, one of our early episodes, we looked at a related issue, the relationship between stress and inflammation, and we're going to have a similar punchline here. All right, background. Glucocorticoids, for anyone who hasn't listened to me for more than 30 seconds, because I usually get around to mentioning them by then. Glucocorticoids, hormones released from the surface, the cortex of the adrenal glands, glucocorticoids secreted during stress, physical stress, psychological stress, human version, cortisol, also known as hydrocortisone, rodent version, corticosterone, all sorts of synthetic versions, dexamethasone, prednisone, triamcinolone, glucocorticoids secreted by the body during physical or psychological stress. Autoimmunity. What does your immune system do? It looks for things that have gotten inside you that are not part of you. Invasive bacteria, viruses, parasites, and then it mounts an immune attack to hopefully save you from that. Every now and then, your immune system does something dreadfully wrong. The only way for this system to work is for your immune system to have a very, very clear sense of the difference between self and non-self. It encounters a red blood cell. It needs to realize that's self, that's me, that belongs there. Red blood cell, neuron, mustache, nostril, whatever. These are things that belong there. And thus, it has to be able to recognize things that are alien, pathogenic invaders. So that's the brilliance of the immune system. And autoimmune diseases occur when the immune system screws up and something that is part of you gets recognized as non-self. And the reasons for this are multitudinous, but the consequences can be truly awful. Okay, so we got glucocorticoids and stress, autoimmunity, recognizing a part of you and deciding that it's not really a part of you, it's something invasive, and attacking it. So the thing that brings these questions together is the fact that stress, psychological, physical stress, increases the likelihood of the initial onset of a variety of autoimmune diseases and increases the likelihood of a relapse for autoimmune diseases that are intermittent. Which autoimmune diseases? A whole list by now: rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, irritable bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, Graves' disease, Hashimoto's disease, multiple sclerosis, a whole list of these. What's the evidence for it? The finding that people first get diagnosed with autoimmune diseases in a period after major stressors in their life, a major loss, a major trauma. The other, a very influential paper published a few years ago in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at an enormous population size, showing that being diagnosed with a stress-related psychiatric disorder, most often depression or anxiety, harking back to the question, is associated with an increased risk of an autoimmune disease emerging in the aftermath. All right, so of course what one wants to know is the mechanisms for this. How is it that stress can cause an increased likelihood of autoimmunity coming out of the woodwork, relapsing, or slowly developing case, suddenly becoming clinically apparent? So we look at two of the main hormones that are suspects when it comes to stress. First one, most famous one, adrenaline. Adrenaline, known in the US as epinephrine, coming out of the center of your adrenal glands, thus adrenaline. A huge number of cells of the immune system are sensitive to adrenaline. It has effects there. That's interesting because if anything, anxiety is associated with elevated activation of the sympathetic nervous system and release of epinephrine related norepinephrine. What's the evidence that overactivation, sympathetic nervous system, can cause changes in the immune system? Lots and lots of evidence. What's the evidence it could cause the sort of changes that are associated with an increased risk of autoimmunity? Squishier. Meanwhile, the other main hormonal mediator of stress, as you heard, are glucocorticoids. And there's by now a literature showing the ways in which glucocorticoids can affect the immune system in ways that, in theory, can lead to autoimmunity. One version of it, glucocorticoids, when the levels are high in response to prolonged stress, suppress the immune system. Whoa, that's extremely well understood how that works on a mechanistic level. Wait a second. You're hopefully saying glucocorticoids, major chronic stress, suppress the immune system. Isn't the problem with autoimmunity that the immune system is overactive, more active than it should be? How do we fit that one together? And what is quite possible is normally, when you have the starts of autoimmunity, your immune system is screwed up and decided your eyelashes are something invasive, another branch of the immune system comes in time and suppresses this abnormal recognition of you as being something invasive, just a second level of surveillance and a safety net. Glucocorticoids suppress the immune system. If they're mostly suppressing the suppressors, that increases the risk of an overshoot. That's one of the models for which there's some evidence. Alternative model, if glucocorticoid levels are high enough with chronic stress, the cells in your body, the tissues in your body, stop listening to glucocorticoids. They decrease the number of receptors for glucocorticoids. Jargon, autoregulation, downregulation of glucocorticoid receptors. And if they downregulate them, then suddenly the immune system can jump out of control, and we see two diametrically opposite mechanisms. It is messy at this point as to how they are working. So that is what you see. That is what you see critically with stress. What do we mean by stress? You got nice resting basal levels of glucocorticoids because you're self-actualized and levitating and things are totally great. And along comes a major stressor and you now secrete more glucocorticoids than normal. You secrete, I don't know, maybe tenfold higher levels than you do basally. This is something resembling the ceiling of what your body can normally pump out, what would be called the maximal physiological response. What about the fact that synthetic glucocorticoids do great things to suppress autoimmunity, to suppress inflammation? These are steroidal anti-inflammatories. People with autoimmune diseases take synthetic glucocorticoids for long afterward to suppress the immune system. People who have had an organ transplant will take synthetic glucocorticoids to keep the immune system from rejecting the organ. Okay, thus we have the main puzzle from this question here. Stress, most likely via elevated glucocorticoid levels, increases the risk of getting an autoimmune disease, while at the same time, somebody with an autoimmune disease, you give them synthetic versions of glucocorticoids to try to protect them from it. And this gave rise to an interesting historical tragedy, if you've got pretty trivial tragedies in your life. But up to the 1950s, an Austrian-Hungarian physician, Hans Selye, who is basically the godfather of stress physiology, monumental figure, one of my heroes, although I have firsthand documentation that he was actually a pretty vile individual. I also can brag that I am an academic great-grandson of Selye, which is to say, person who trained me, was trained by Selye. Hans Selye, working out in the 1930s what glucocorticoids were doing, all sorts of diseases of stress, made this very critical, loud, self-aggrandizing prediction that stress and glucocorticoids were going to be shown to cause autoimmune diseases and cause excessive inflammation. And then in the 1950s, along came this trio of scientists, Kendall, Hench, and Reichstag. No, not Reichstag, interestingly, Reichstein, where they were the ones who first showed synthetic glucocorticoids could flatten inflammation and flatten the immune system. And that ushered in the whole era of people being put on steroids, synthetic glucocorticoids, to treat autoimmunity, to treat inflammatory diseases, from cortisone cream for your poison ivy to people who are kept alive with their autoimmune diseases thanks to corticosteroids, synthetic glucocorticoids. Exactly the opposite of what Selye predicted. Glucocorticoids were suppressing inflammation. Glucocorticoids were suppressing autoimmune diseases. Totally counter to Selye's prediction. He went down in flames. General interpretation is that cost him his Nobel Prize. These guys got it instead. And in the words of this pioneering endocrinologist, Alan Monk, the discovery of the immunosuppressive effects of glucocorticoids, the ability to protect against autoimmunity, to protect against out-of-control inflammation from the standpoint of the old guard of stress physiology, Selye and buddies. This was, quote, the most cataclysmic event in the history of glucocorticoid research. And presumably that even included that glucocorticoid conference that was on Krakatoa when the volcano blew. But in any case, this seemed to be totally counter to Selye. What is the resolution here? And exactly what explains this question, back to stress, even terrible stress, producing elevations of glucocorticoid levels, the highest levels your body can ever manage on its own, what are termed physiological levels. In contrast, when you put somebody on synthetic glucocorticoids, you're giving them a couple of magnitudes higher. You're giving them what are termed pharmacological levels. Pharmacological levels of glucocorticoids, without question, crush the immune system and thus crush the overactivation of autoimmunity, crush inflammation. This is what pharmacological levels do. Whereas physiological levels, it turns out in some domains they increase inflammation, in others they're anti-inflammatory. In some domains, as we saw, stress increases the likelihood of autoimmune hysteria going over the top. We've got a contrast, a classical contrast between the physiological effect of a hormone or the drugs that mimic that hormone versus the pharmacological effects. And the resolution is physiological elevations of glucocorticoids up to the normal physiological ceiling for long periods increase the likelihood of autoimmune disease, worsen many aspects of inflammation, and that is totally compatible with massive pharmacological levels of synthetic glucocorticoids being very effective. So that's something that puzzled everyone, and Selye went to his grave without understanding what the resolution was of that. That's the answer to the question.
Okay, so the punchline is that when it comes to stress and autoimmune disorders, physiological and pharmacological effects of glucocorticoids are very different. In previous episodes, we've talked about people using testosterone like androgens without prescriptions, very recently, people using peptides to build up muscle. Is it the same punchline with them, that there is a big difference between physiological and pharmacological levels of these compounds, and people are typically taking pharmacological levels, and that is where some unexpected serious downsides might pop up?
Exactly. Both of those are examples of that. Way back when we talked about testosterone, its effects on aggression, its effects on sexual behavior, all sorts of myths about that. And a big emphasis was on guys who go take synthetic androgens, synthetic versions of testosterone, to pack on muscle, and these guys who are abusing androgens. And what you have there is they are taking pharmacological levels as opposed to physiological, and pharmacological, which can have a lot of adverse effects on health and behavior. In terms of peptides, a few weeks ago, same issue. Are people who are taking them to pack on muscle in the gym, are they taking physiological levels of these peptides or pharmacological? At this point, it's not clear, which is part of why caution should be used.
Now, Mac from Los Angeles says, I saw a Stanford study showing that about 7,000 years ago, men nearly wiped themselves out. Did this set up the patterns in males for dominance we see today, and will they wipe themselves out again?
Oh, what a rabbit hole this question sent me down. What we're considering is what's called an evolutionary bottleneck. Something happens where 95% of a population disappears, some massive event, and what you have left, the 5%, hypothetically, the 5% are the ones who had some trait that saved their neck. And that caused this trait to become much more common now in the descendants of that great trimming, great bottleneck. Now, it's been known for some time that there was a massive bottleneck in humans about 800 to 900,000 years ago. Something happened, and people are still debating it. Something happened so that there was a massive crash in human population. And what most of the people who understand this estimate is humans were down to somewhere between 1 and 3,000 people on Earth, teetering on the edge of extinction. And the best evidence is that for 100,000 years afterward, this population size of humans was very slowly recovering from that. So we were on the edge of a cliff then. Of course, this brings up a question. How do you know this happened 800 to 900,000 years ago? And the first question is, how do you get a sense of a clock when you look at contemporary gene distributions as to how far back when something happened? Okay, so what we see in this diagram here are two hypothetical humans. Each of them, bizarre humans that they each have 6 genes, and each gene comes in different types. And what we see is 5 out of the 6 genes these two individuals share, shown in blue. And for the 6th gene, they differ because of some mutational event that happened back when. And you construct a molecular clock, you get some reasonably informed guess at what the rate is of mutations that will spread in a whole population. You now have a mutational clock. You can extrapolate backwards and decide that these two individuals last had a shared parent where these two lines intersect. In contrast, next diagram, we've got our humans with 6 genes, and in this case, they're sharing only 3 out of the 6. The others differ due to mutational events, and you do the same back calculations and you see, ooh, their last common ancestor, a shared parent, was that much further back in time. Third example, only 1 out of the 6 are shared. Extrapolate back even further back in time. That's how you begin to get a sense of how long ago events occurred using this molecular clock. So the next question becomes, how do people know that there was a population crash at that time, 800 to 900,000 years ago? And you use these techniques now to see how recently 2 individuals shared an ancestor, and you do it on vast numbers of people. And what you see on the left is you get sort of a genetic tree of relatedness going back a long, long period. And this is a hypothetical one where it just so happens that the horizontal bar there in yellow, that was 8 to 900,000 years ago. This is when nothing interesting happened. In contrast, on the right, you see what happened during that bottleneck 8 to 900,000 years ago. And what occurred there is some sort of catastrophe such that the number of reproducing humans was down to very, very little. And this is apparently what happened. So that's a circumstance where there was a massive, massive drop in the number of humans on Earth, and we made it out the other end of that bottleneck. Then, about 15 years ago, there was a paper that found evidence for a different sort of bottleneck in humans 8,000 years ago in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And this group showed there was a massive decrease in the variability of genetics among males, not females. There was a great decrease in the percentage of males who left copies of their genes for future generations. How do you figure this out? All right, females are XX chromosomes, males are XY. Thus, if you're looking at a gene on the Y chromosome in some guy, he got it from his father. Who got it from his father? It's only a male lineage of genes on the Y chromosome, and you can use that to trace back among males. Meanwhile, females have mitochondrial DNA. All mitochondria have DNA that they got from their mothers. You get your mitochondria from your mothers, and thus mitochondrial DNA is a way of tracing back female lineages. And what they showed in this study using this technique was there was a big crash in the incidence of Y chromosome-related genes in humans around that time. The percentage of males who were reproducing crashed enormously during that period without a change in the variance, the percentage of females who were reproducing. Something happened to the males during that time. And what the questioner is alluding to is a 2015 paper in Nature from Stanford, senior author Mark Feldman, a colleague in my department, who offered an explanation for why during that period there was such a steep decline in the percentage of males who were passing on copies of their genes. And their speculation, which they then argued in the paper, was this was due to warfare. Entire populations of men were being wiped out due to warfare. This was a period where agriculture and pastoralism was coming to dominate the planet, and this is when warfare really picked up a lot of speed. Hunter-gatherers, we've covered, do not have organized warfare to any extent. This was warfare. Chariots were arriving on the scene, and the estimates in their paper were 15% of male populations were being lost every generation to warfare. Of course, one wants to know, is there any precedent for this? Do wars wipe out substantial percentages of the males in populations? And there's plenty of evidence for this. 400 BC, Peloponnesian War, the Athenians crushed the people on Melos or Melos, and they killed 100% of the males in this conquered city. And the females were allowed to survive, and you better bet things did not go very well for them afterward, completely wiping out the male genetic variability in this population. 200 BC, Hannibal, Carthage, his elephants fighting the Romans, most famously Battle of Cannae, and two subsequent battles where unexpectedly, Hannibal and his friends crushed the Romans, and over the course of those three defeats, approximately 20% of military-age males were lost from the gene pool in Rome. Other examples, U.S. Civil War, 27% of military-age Southern males were killed, removed from the gene pool. Around the same time, Paraguay had apparently one of the great poorly planned wars. It went to war against Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay, and before that was over, best estimates are about half the males in Paraguay of military age were killed. World War I, about 50% of males in Serbia were killed. In France, 27% of military-age men were killed. In England, roughly the same numbers. In the aftermath of World War I, there was an excess of 1.5 million reproductive age women to men. And during that period, 38% of reproductive aged British women never married or reproduced. And there's this famous anecdote from that period during World War I, apparently at some hoity-toity private women's school, one teacher stood up and said, "Girls, you are never going to have husbands. You are never going to get married because they're all getting killed in that stupid war. You are never going to do that. So you better study hard because you're going to have to make your way on your own." Other cases, East Timor had a completely bloody war of independence against Indonesia some decades back, which worked, and the Indonesians were absolutely savage, decimating the populations in East Timor, the military populations, and eventually international pressure. East Timor was going to have to get independence, and some Indonesian leader, I can't remember if it was a general, one of the most chilling sentences out there, he said, "Yeah, you folks are going to get your independence, but you're going to be a nation of widows." So there's lots of precedent historically for wars wiping out a big percentage of the population of males and thus decreasing genetic variability in the process. Okay, so that's the war argument in this paper. A few years later, another Nature paper arguing a different scenario, looking at power and economics, that you don't have to kill males to have males reduced from the gene pool. You just have to have a wildly unequal society where a subset of the males are doing wildly disproportionate amount of reproducing. And the textbook example is Genghis Khan from 12th century. And the best estimates are there are 16 million men on Earth who were direct genetic descendants of Genghis Khan. A recent paper in PNAS challenged that a bit, but nonetheless, he probably holds the record for the most reproductively successful human male of all time. Concubines and vast numbers and spoils of war and all of that. He's not the only case of that. 16th century Chinese Emperor Gioconga, who is another one of those. Current estimates are 1.5 million men in northern China are direct descendants of this guy. Another example of this ancient Irish chieftain named Niall Noigalla in the 5th century, and he apparently was fruitful and multiplied. And get a load of these numbers in Northern Ireland, Northwest Ireland, where he had his sway. 21% of the men there are direct genetic descendants of him. 8% of men in Ireland as a whole are direct descendants of him. And in New York City, 2% of the men in New York City, Irish, are genetic descendants of him as well. So we've got lots of precedent for you don't need war, you need very, very unequal distribution of male opportunities for mating. Interestingly, Niall was known as Niall of the Nine Hostages, which is apparently what his name in Irish means, his nickname. And puzzlingly, I read two totally opposing versions as to where that came from. One was he had a captive enemy chieftain who was his hostage, and he had 9 of his best warriors attack this guy, and somehow the hostage managed to kill all of them, which seems like a weird thing that there was only one hostage. The other is that apparently once he came to power, he demanded hostages from 9 neighboring chiefdoms to be brought in, and the usual deal, mess with me and you're an important person who we have as a hostage here gets it. And some of you with a very, very adult sense of analogy will recognize this is exactly the case in the history of cell biology when mitochondria joined other cells to become organelles, mitochondria that were independent organisms at the time with their own DNA, as we heard before, joined in, and they did some sort of version of the big cell had some kind of give us a hostage to show that you're not going to do some internal rebellious thing, give me some of your DNA. And ever since, some of the mitochondrial genes have been found in the nuclear genome. So exactly the same case. All right, so we see precedent here for examples where disproportionate of male reproductive opportunities could produce a decrease in the variability. Then, another possibility, a total counter to this, which is showing in lots of societies, men marry, reproduce at considerably later ages than women. The world of 13-year-old prides, let alone 10-year-old or 5-year-old ones. And in more traditional societies, going back 7,000 years, people were not living a long time, so that by the time men were getting to the age where they were marrying, there was a whole lot of dead ones at that, and thus you have a reproductive skew, an age lag, and that's why male genetic variability was decreasing. Now, an additional piece of this speculation was the emergence 8,000 years ago of patrilocal societies. Patrilocal, woman marries a man and she goes to live with his relatives. Matrilocal, exactly the opposite. Hunter-gatherers have a higher rate of matrilocal societies than pastoralists and agriculturalists do, who have very high rates. About 70% of historical cultures on Earth were patrilocal. About 15% were matrilocal. The rest, I don't know, they were just confused or polyamory or God knows what. But what you see there is this was the period where agriculture and pastoralism were pushing hunter-gatherers back all over the planet. The planet became predominantly patrilocal. And you have a whole other mechanism here. These patrilocal guys who are all related don't have to kill all the males in the neighboring tribe. They don't have to be the only ones who reproduce. They just have to be successful enough. And because they're all close relatives, there's a default with more and more success. Genetically, they default into historically being a single historical individual, the one who started that patrilineal line. So we got three competing models. It was warfare entire populations of men. Notice it would have to be patrilocal populations of men that were wiped out by war. That's a prerequisite for that leading to the decreased variability. If there was no difference in the variability, that would be a mechanism for a total population crash. But if patrilocal, you were selectively taking out males who were related to each other. So there's the war scenario. There's the socioeconomic inequality scenario where powerful rich men were disproportionately reproducing. There was the age lag model, or there was the simple patrilineal one where get a stable enough line of relatives forming a clan and they're going to show decreased genetic variability. So there's mixed models for all of them, and you look across that period, and if you look back at what percentage of shared genes and extrapolate back, you could find in some cases entire lineages completely disappeared around 7,000 years ago. That's probably a marker of war. In other cases, it gradually winnowed away during that period. That's probably a marker of some of the other mechanisms. So it was mixed depending on where this was happening. So what have the consequences been of historical examples of decrease in the male population size, decrease in the percentage of males who were reproducing, the amount of genetic variability? One of the things you've got is if it's a decrease in population size and there's not a decrease in the female population size, you've got a very skewed female to male ratio. And what's one of the cultural things that have been come up with? Polygamy. Polygamy is one of the solutions to that. Now, broadly, anthropologists recognize there's a number of pathways to polygamy in a society. One is an economic one, where it's the rich guys who can purchase new wives. And when one finds that women are doing much of the work at home, what a new wife is an economic boost for you. It's kind of like buying a second winter home for the ski season so you got more equity in your holdings. There's that. There's, of course, the most extreme cases of that of Genghis Khan, where it's the most powerful, the richest, so on. So we got mitochondrial brides is one possibility there. The economics of very wealthy men being able to have multiple wives, which means in a normal population, 50-50, that means a lot of the men are not going to be passing on copies of their genes. So that's one possible consequence of a skewed sex ratio and a route by which you get polygamy selected for. Another one is demographic, the warfare scenario. Another one is demographic. Guys are a lot older than women girls are when reproducing in some of these societies, and thus they've been winnowed away. Of course, the war scenarios have sexual slavery and mass rapes and other nightmarish things as part of the demographic consequences of that. Then you've got, in some cultures, polygamy is allowed along the lines of if your brother has died, you are expected to marry and take care of his widow. Now, in the course of my reading up on this, I stumbled into something I had no idea about, which was the Islamic permission of a man to have up to 4 wives. And at least in the interpretations I read, this was not, you were allowed to have up to 4 wives back in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century or whatever. This was, you can't have more than 4 wives, because something more than that apparently was very common at the time. This was, you can't have more wives than you can take care of. And there was an additional stricture in one interpretation of the Quran, which was saying you can only have multiple wives if you treat them equally, if you treat them equitably. And then a little bit later, it goes on to say, and whoa, that's basically impossible. This may have been a demand, in fact, for single wives, monogamy, pair bonding, but this somehow, I don't know, got lost in the translation, but this is the origins of 4 wives, not you can have as many as 4, you can only have 4, not more than that. Okay, so we get back to the starting point of this question. Is this likely to happen again? Oh, I don't know. We are not that far past some of these. The last century involved World War I, yeah, a little bit more than the last century, World War II, East Timor, the other examples there. Almost certainly this is going to happen again. Is this a good thing if some males do not pass on copies of their genes? And all I can quote is the Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan, of I've got a little list, they never would be missed. It could, in fact, be very great if all sorts of males do not pass on copies of their genes.
And that's it. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.